Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to answer a question that one of our commenters, one of our viewers had. By the way, if you have any questions, then please put it in the comments below. Click something down there and write whatever it is your question is. Happy to make some content for you. If you haven't already, go and click the subscribe button, click the notification bell. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about today, though, before we go on to that. And that is, where is the best place for Canadians to form offshore companies? And this will be broadly applicable to some other people as well, so it is going to be Canadian-centric because that was the question that they asked, but I'll try and make it relevant for a broader range of people as well. If you haven't already, though, like I said, click the subscribe button, get notified of our upcoming videos by smashing the notification bell, and if you like the video, click the thumbs up. By the way, on this channel, what do we talk about? We talk about international tax structuring, so how to pay the lowest legal amount of tax possible, as close to zero as possible. If you're interested in that, reach out to us. How to protect your assets from creditors, from lawsuits, from bad credit, from bankruptcy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How to go and get offshore citizenships, but second citizenships, passports, residencies, open up bank accounts, open up other companies, etc. And so if you're interested in any of those subjects, please reach out to us, cordia.fm/Michael Rosmer. You can book a call with me in the link below, or visit our websites, offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com. Let's dive in. So what is this subject of where to form a company? So let's just I'm going to try again and speak broadly to everybody, but narrow in specifically on Canadians, or people who are Canadian residents, actually, because citizenship doesn't really matter here. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all, okay? I did a video previously on, hey, where's the best place to form an offshore company? The reality is there isn't one, right? And the reason is that there's a lot of different factors to consider. However, I'm going to try and give you some of the factors that really matter based on the rules. And I tried to do country-by-country specific guides, so if you want to go look, we have one for Sweden, one for Norway, one for Finland, one for Italy, one for France, one for Spain, etc. And so if there's one that's specific to you, by all means, go and check it out. I'll try and do a more complete one for Canadians at some point in time in the future. But what's the deal here when it comes to Canada? Well, or actually broadly, you want to start off by realizing, is the company truly an offshore company? What do I mean by this? What I mean is, very often under the residency rules, you can form a foreign company and it's considered a local company, okay? You can go and check out some of our videos on, what is tax residency, etc. Right? That's probably your most basic starting point. Okay, is, hey, listen, what do I have to do to genuinely have a foreign company? Because I don't want to be a resident of Canada, of Brazil, of Australia, of New Zealand, of France, of wherever, and form a company in BVI thinking, hey, look, this is great. I've got this company and it's in a zero tax country. That's great. What do I have to do next? Well, the truth is, if your management and control of that company is in this case Canada, but it could be Australia, it could be Brazil, it could be France, it could be a large portion of the world's countries, then that's going to be considered a local tax resident country or company, sorry. And as a result, it's fully taxable locally. You gained yourself nothing, okay? So let's look at this in the context of Canada, and we're going to expand into some other pieces later. So Canada has this rule, okay, which is that your company is tax resident where it's managed and controlled, but there is an exception to this, okay? So first of all, ideally, just in general, you want to have your management and control outside the country. That's much easier. But certainly as a tiebreaker, there are some of the tax treaties that override that provision, okay? So let's look at some of the key ones that might matter to you. One is the US. Okay, so if you form a company in the US, even if you manage and control it from Canada, it's considered a US company under the tax treaty. Okay, Bulgaria is another one. Estonia is another one. Barbados is another one. UAE is sort of, but in a really weird way that doesn't make it useful. Okay, so just for the record, UAE is a terrible place for Canadians to form companies. Okay, terrible. Basically, the way that this works is when you're assessing where a company should be tax resident, you can look at your local tax residency rules, okay? You can look at the foreign tax residency rules, and you should look at the tax treaties between them. If you go to, it's typically Article 4 is the section on residency, and you'll read through, there'll be this whole part on individuals, and then they'll come to this part about if I'm going to screw up the language here, but basically if somebody other than a natural person is in dispute as to where they are, meaning they could be in one or they could be in the other, here's how we're figuring it out. And there will be a clause that explains what's called the tiebreaker clause that nails this down, okay? Very, very important, so worth reading those. Basically, you get some Eastern European countries. In the case of Canada, you get, like I said, the US, and you get Barbados. So Barbados is a really interesting one. So if you look historically, a lot of countries have kind of like a traditional tax haven. Okay, so Labuan for Malaysia, Netherlands Antilles for Netherlands, Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey, etc. for UK. For Portugal, you have Madeira. You have the Canary Islands for Spain, etc. Right? So it's quite normal that historically countries would have their own little tax haven that would be common for them. Canada's is primarily Barbados. Okay, why Barbados? There's two main reasons that Barbados has traditionally been the tax haven. Okay, and by the way, why it really doesn't make a lot of sense for you anymore. Okay, number one, because Barbados has a tax treaty, a double tax agreement. Okay, so normally what happened was that in the case of Canada, there's a set of rules called the exempt surplus rules. Okay, and the exempt surplus rules, in order for those to apply, up until I think it was 2012, you had to have a company which was resident in a country which had a double tax agreement with Canada. And Barbados was pretty much the only very low tax country that had that, because normally they don't have double tax agreements with zero tax countries because there's no double tax, right? Makes perfect sense. They changed that rule in 2012. They expanded it to say if they had a tax information exchange agreement, that would also happen. And that it would also apply. And so it opened up a wide range of countries that were zero tax countries for Canadians. And as a result, the appeal of Barbados went down somewhat. Now, it was still habit for tax planners in Canada to recommend Barbados. They'd been using it for a lot of years. They had relationships there, etc. So people continued to recommend Barbados, even though Barbados in theory actually meant higher tax and potentially higher costs and things like this. But the second reason that even in that situation, Barbados was still pretty good was that the tiebreaker provision in the Canada-Barbados tax treaty stated that if there was a dispute, it would go to the place that the company was registered, okay? And so if you'd registered the company in Barbados, then even if they said, hey, well, it should be based on management and control, be a Canadian company, then it will fall to a Barbados company. Now, there's a little bit of caveat on this, and this actually helped to reinforce Barbados' position. And that is that in order for it to be a Barbados tax resident company, typically we were looking at a Barbadian IBC, because there was an IBC and an RBC. So if you had a Barbadian IBC, then it had to be managed and controlled from Barbados, or at least it had to have local directors there. So they kind of killed two birds with one stone. Okay, that was like a smart thing that Barbados did to make themselves the Canadian tax haven. As I said, times have changed. Things are quite different. It's hard to get bank accounts in or for kind of these Caribbean type companies. Barbados is actually it's an odd one because people don't talk about it that much, and it actually has some decent advantages because the Canadian banks are so well established there. But it's still like one of these countries that is like, people are like, oh, it's not really a loved country in that respect. Second of all, it has island culture, so what this means is they're slow, a little bit more laid back, etc. So getting things done, it's less business friendly than if you're in like Estonia, for instance, right? Number three, getting things like credit card processing. So if you're in e-commerce or something like that, that's not going to work so well for you. Okay, so as a Canadian, it's still possible, right? If you were, say, an affiliate marketer, that might be a way to go. Usually we wouldn't recommend that. Usually we would say, okay, great, let's go with something different, and as a result, go and use whatever other place. And so this is where places like Estonia come in. This is places like, in theory, you could use places like Isle of Man and Jersey and Guernsey, etc., or Labuan or Hong Kong or any of these other ones, if the management control is not in Canada, which means basically that the highest level decision making takes place outside of Canada. Okay, that's the first thing. So now we ask the question, well, where would you want to set up if you were a Canadian? And let's talk briefly here about two ones that stand out. One is the US, because the US is kind of interesting since you can have a US LLC. Okay, now here's the kind of quasi-interesting thing. So technically speaking, a US company is going to be considered tax resident in the US regardless of if it's managed in Canada. Okay, that in theory is a good start. However, of course, if you have a US C Corp or something, it's fully taxable in the US, so that didn't really gain you anything. Now, what if you had a US LLC and you had no effectively connected income with US trade or business, you had no US source income, etc.? Potentially that LLC would not be taxable in the US, right? So is this a good situation? Yes and no. So the problem is that it's questionable whether you can get that LLC to qualify under the tax treaty. You can go through, there's some case law on this, and it certainly is somewhat in jeopardy. There have been some cases where it did work out. I think actually even with TD Bank had a case where it ended up being deemed US tax resident, even though it was an LLC. But broadly, there is a chance that you don't get the tax treaty provisions applied there. So you would still want to worry about the management and control side of it, okay? That being said, that would give you access to US banking, to payments infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. That might be a good option for you. Now let's talk about UAE. Here's the weird thing about UAE. So you can have a United Arab Emirates company. The United Arab Emirates company, in theory, the tax treaty says that, hey, listen, it doesn't matter where it's managed and controlled, it matters where it's registered, and UAE would fit that bill. The problem is, if you actually read the residency section of the tax treaty, what you're going to find is that the criteria that needs to be laid out to meet that standard under the tax treaty is basically impossible. Canadians pretty much can't get it, like as individuals, right? So if you were to go and be resident in UAE as a resident, they basically, under the tax treaty, you wouldn't be protected, okay? Now, doesn't mean you can't have a clean break from Canada and leave and go and live in UAE. Of course you can, right? If you genuinely are not resident in Canada, but you certainly don't get the protection of the tax treaty. That's the first thing. But when it comes to companies, what you're going to find is only if all the business is carried out in UAE is it protected, okay? So if that's not your case, then that's not a very strong argument, okay? It doesn't work very well in your favor. And so this starts to raise the question of, if you're a Canadian, where should you go, okay? In my opinion, probably the best thing to do is to actually build up substance abroad, okay? This is not necessarily what people like to hear, but I think that it is the smartest thing to do in today's day and age. So again, it varies case by case. I think there are some cases where having a US LLC makes sense. I think there can be some rare occasions where some other European country might make sense, right? There can be times where Estonia makes sense. There can be times where a bunch of these different countries make sense. A lot less so. Estonia has some problems with getting money out, etc. So that's typically not the case. I think, generally speaking, as a Canadian, the best place to form a company is Labuan. Okay, so if you're not familiar with this, it's a part of Malaysia. It's covered under the Malaysian tax treaty. It doesn't have this tiebreaker clause, so it's not going to go based on place of registration, so that's not going to help you. So you're going to need foreign management and control. But in order to be able to utilize that company, you need to have local substance anyway, which is helpful. It's going to allow you access to good banking, and the cost of labor there is quite low. So all of these things make it a pretty attractive place to form a company for Canadians, in my view. It's not going to give you the same type of protection that you might get from a place like Barbados. So there may be an argument that in some circumstances, Barbados might work. There may be an argument that someplace like Bulgaria or Estonia, etc., might work. Okay, these are places that can work, but tougher. Now, let's talk about some places that you don't want to go, because that's equally important. What you want to do if you're figuring out, hey, where should I be setting that up, is you want to make sure you have a tax treaty. Why? Because for a Canadian, the best structure typically is going to be to have, unless you're utilizing some sort of a crazy trust structure, and trusts are super complicated when you're dealing with Canada, so that's a whole other conversation. What you're normally going to want is you're going to want a Canadian company, and the Canadian company is going to own the foreign company, okay? What does this allow you to do? It allows you to repatriate dividends tax-free under certain circumstances, okay? So your foreign company needs to be in a country that has a tax treaty with Canada, which can be a double tax agreement or a tax information exchange agreement, in order to be able to repatriate those dividends tax-free. If not, you don't get that benefit. Okay, it's called the exempt surplus rules. Okay, so in that sense, you want to make sure you're one of those. So let's talk about, for instance, a country that I think is a wonderful country in certain respects that you wouldn't want to use is Georgia, right? You wouldn't want to use Georgia. You wouldn't want to use Gibraltar. Okay, Gibraltar doesn't have a tax treaty with Canada. If I recall correctly, and I'd have to double check again, I think that Panama doesn't have a tax treaty with Canada. So Panama would be out. Marshall Islands would be out, etc. Like there's a bunch of these places that even if you could use them based on some other criteria, and typically you wouldn't want to say use Marshall Islands these days, although we used to love them back in the day, even if that was the case, you're not going to be in a situation where it's going to make sense in the future. So that's pretty much the deal, is you want to say, okay, great, where should I form? First of all, is there a tax treaty? Number two, what is the situation with genuine tax residency? Number three, is the country a country that is going to fit my needs in terms of the financial infrastructure? So does it give banking that is going to support me? Do I need something like payment processing? If I do, what is it going to offer in that respect? Do I need access to some sort of a talent pool? If so, what does it give me in that respect? So anyway, that's kind of the summary. This same basic thought process can be applied to a bunch of countries, right? So if I was to look at, where should I form a company in the case of UK, right? What would I do? I would go and take a look at some similar factors, right? I'd say, okay, genuinely, where can we have the company be foreign tax resident? Where is it that is going to work for repatriation? Now, it turns out UK, it's actually repatriation is really simple. In the case of UK, I would look more at paying attention to the controlled foreign companies rules, right? So paying attention to these factors to say, okay, what's the best place? Should I have the company held by a local person or a local company, or held in some other foreign structure? These would be the factors. So anyway, I hope that answers the question that was asked about, hey, listen, for a Canadian, where's the best place to form? I'll just quickly to recap. The US, maybe. Barbados, could be, maybe. Labuan, maybe. One of these European countries that you might take advantage of the payment infrastructure or something like that. Those are basically going to be your top options as a Canadian who is interested in forming a company abroad to do some sort of international business, whether it's some sort of e-commerce or affiliate marketing or whatever else. Those sorts of things would be where I would typically look, and I would look at having them owned by my Canadian holding company, which is really just a Canadian company, as opposed to owned directly. Okay, hope that helps. If you have any questions about that, if you'd like some help with how to set up your international structure, what's the best option for you, etc., please reach out to me. You can book a call, cordia.fm/Michael Rosmer. There's a link below, as well as, citizenships, residencies, asset protection, banking, etc., etc. You can also check out our website, offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please, let me know. Click the thumbs up. Click the notification bell and the subscribe button. I guess the opposite direction. Click the subscribe button and then the notification bell. And yeah, we're going to see you guys on the next video.